Hello and welcome to Whys of History Episode 5, Crimea/Ukraine edition, where everything's made up and the public pretense is propagated to promote perennial partisan policies don't matter. As a reminder, this first episode is going to focus on Crimea and why Russia decided to up and annex that sucker in March of 2014, whereas part 2 will focus on the long and troubled history between Russia and Ukraine. If you need a rundown of the event or just want to see Sam's glorious mug, you can click over here. Part 1. So wait, why did Russia invade Crimea? Or did it annex Crimea? Also, what's a Crimea? Well, it seems a bit silly to hit those first questions without an understanding of that last one, so let's hit that last one first. Crimea is this peninsula in Eastern Europe that juts out into the Black Sea. It has a population of about 2 million people, is a common destination for Russian tourists, and has some of the only decent coastline in the northern Black Sea, making it a vital trading area for centuries. Crimea itself has a long and complicated history that we're now going to breeze through in like 3 to 4 paragraphs. Throughout history, Crimea has been under the control of everyone from the Scythians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Byzantines to the Ottomans, and was often known for its role in the European and Middle Eastern slave trade. 1400 CE, Crimea was ruled by the Crimean Khanate, a Turkic Muslim kingdom that was part of the Ottoman Empire until the late 18th century when, after a few years of independence, it was annexed by the Russian Empire. It's important to note that, much like Ukraine, the native people of Crimea were not ethnically Russian and are known as Tatars. The Tatars that formed the Crimean Khanate were ethnically, linguistically, and religiously much more related to Turks and Mongols than Russians or Europeans, so naturally they weren't big fans of being in the Russian Empire. Throughout the 19th century, Tatars began to leave Crimea either by force or at will, and ethnic Russians filled their places. So if you've heard of Crimea before 2014, it's probably because you are an esteemed peninsula lover, or perhaps it's more likely that you've heard of the Crimean War, which took place in the mid-1850s. A result of religious concerns, territorial disputes in Eastern Europe, and the fears of an increasingly powerful Russia dominating a declining Ottoman Empire, the war pit Imperial Russia against an alliance of Britain, France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire, and ended with a Russian defeat. While there was fighting in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, the Baltic Sea, and the Pacific, the highlight of the war is usually the siege of Sevastopol in 1854, where the Allied powers defeated the Russian defenders after a year-long siege, leaving much of the city in ruins. The war would end as a disaster for all sides, really, with disease and mismanagement killing far more soldiers than the actual fighting did. Outside of Russia and historical circles, the Crimean War is often remembered for the infamous Charge of the Light Brigade, where a British cavalry unit charged to its death due to the previously mentioned mismanagement. The Crimean War saw many beginnings of what we would consider modern warfare. Telegraph lines were used to relay messages, modern-esque battlefield medicine under the famous Florence Nightingale was used, and battlefield photography and war correspondence began to take a shape that we might actually recognize today. In Russia itself, the war is remembered for the valiant sacrifices of the Russians who fought there, and the defeat cost Russia its Black Sea fleet and would contribute to the ending of Russian serfdom in 1861. Crimea remained more or less under Russian and then Soviet control until World War II, when it was occupied by the Nazis during their offensive in 1941. While much of Crimea was overrun quite quickly, the city of Sevastopol held out until 1942, and much like during the Crimean War, the city was basically leveled by the fighting. Happy to be rid of Soviet control, many Crimean Tatars actively fought for the German army, and when Soviet control was re-established in 1944, Stalin forcibly expelled the Tatars from Crimea as a punishment for their lack of loyalty to the USSR. As the remaining Tatars were deported, ethnic Russians were moved in, and it wasn't until the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s that Tatars were able to return to the Crimea. So Jordan, it sounds like Crimea was a pretty Russian place. How did Crimea go from being part of Russia to part of Ukraine? Thanks, me. What a great question. In 1954, Crimea was officially transferred from Russia to Ukraine by the then head of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, both due to the practical and logistical reasons, and as a way of commemorating the 300th anniversary of Ukraine's official joining with Russia. At the time, this move had little significance, as Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea were all part of the USSR anyway, so it was more a gesture of friendship from Khrushchev than one with any real consequence. When Ukraine became independent with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Crimea voted to become a semi-autonomous region of Ukraine rather than rejoin Russia, and it was granted its own parliament and government. While the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine wasn't a big deal during the Soviet era, it became a fairly big one when the USSR broke apart, as Russia has a fleet stationed in the Black Sea that is based out of Sevastopol. Up until the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Ukraine had leased the naval base to Russia in exchange for cheaper Russian gas. Now that we've gotten the history out of the way, let's step into the present. So as of this recording in late April of 2014, Crimea has officially become a part of the Russian Federation after the people of Crimea voted to break from Ukraine and join Russia. The vote followed a murky Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea, the details of which are hotly contested and fairly unclear. The annexation was approved by the Russian government, and this move was very popular with the Russian people themselves, many of whom see the 1954 transfer of Crimea to Ukraine as a blunder by Khrushchev or a slight against the Russians. Not surprisingly, this whole affair has been contested by Ukraine, NATO, and the EU, who all see the elections as more or less rigged and the annexation is illegal. The official justification for the invasion by Russian President Vladimir Putin was the protection of the Russian-speaking populations in the Crimea who could be threatened by a pro-Ukraine, anti-Russian regime that has resulted from the ousting of President Yanukovych. This isn't an unreasonable claim, as Crimea is over 60% ethnically Russian, but with sizable Ukrainian and Tatar minorities. In his speech to the Russian government on the annexation of Crimea, President Putin noted Crimea's long-standing historical, linguistic, and cultural ties to Russia as justification for Russian action there. He noted the valiant sacrifices of Russians in defending Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, in particular during the Crimean War and World War II. He also argued that Russia has been continuously slighted or cheated by Western powers like NATO and the EU in the post-Cold War era, as many European countries have fallen into Western spheres of influence. Putin also repeatedly noted the democratic process by which Crimea overwhelmingly opted to join Russia, despite the fact that before the invasion, less than half of Crimeans sought unification with Russia. All that being said, there's definitely a more geopolitical reason going on here. Control of Crimea gives Russia permanent access to its Black Sea fleet and the valuable trading port that is Sevastopol. Not only does Russia now have complete control of the naval base its fleet was stationed out of, there is speculation that the Black Sea itself may have large untapped oil reserves, which Russia would now have access to. Part 3. So, is there even a part 2 in this? No, I don't think I think I wrote part 3, but there's no part 2. Part 3. Where did part 2 go? At the end of the day, despite having a reasonable claim to Crimea, it's hard to know how this is going to play out for Russia. While the extent of US and EU sanctions and the long-term effects on Russia's economy are uncertain at this point, it's undeniable that Russia's international standing has taken a hit. This move may have made Putin more popular in Russia, but outside his country he's being painted as everything from an imperialist and a warmonger who wants to restore the Soviet Union to a paranoid ideologue who does what he wants and can't be reasoned with. On a final note, as with so many current events, history is utterly entwined within this whole fiasco. Part of Russia's claim over Crimea is a historical one. Crimea was more or less Russian territory for over 150 years before it was given to Ukraine. The majority of the people there are Russian, and the region holds a lot of significance in Russian history. Given that, it doesn't seem unreasonable, historically speaking, for Crimea to be a part of Russia. So ignoring the dubious circumstances of its actual transfer, why should it be a part of Russia? On the surface, history might make the situation seem fairly clear-cut, but this justification breaks apart a bit when you look deeper. Crimea, as a region, has been non-Russian for much longer than it has been Russian. The sizable minorities of Crimea are not Russian and don't much like Russia, and part of the reason they are minorities to begin with is because the Russian government kicked out just about everyone else and moved Russians in. This last point is huge in many of the non-Russian areas of the former Soviet Union, where the native peoples were often moved out and ethnic Russians were moved in. This begs the question of whose side history is on here. Who is in the right? How much value should we place on historical or cultural claims to places or territory if we place any value at all? Can we fault Russia here for being paranoid or intervening in its own backyard? How should we handle territorial or ethnic or linguistic problems in the 21st century? These questions aren't going away, mostly because we're going to keep bringing them up in part 2. Thank you very much for watching. If you got questions or concerns or critique, please throw that in a comment or visit our Facebook page where you can chat with us and see all the cool history-related stuff that we post. You can click on this picture of Vladimir Putin over here to go on to part 2. I appreciate your time. I am Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class. When Crimea
You Crimea.
Yeah, you Crimea Russian.
Crimea rain.
You Crimea rain. That's like a Coldplay song right there, you know.
Bob Marley. You Crimea rain.
Okay. Turkey-Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea, the details of which are hotly uncontested. The details of which are extremely clear and nobody is debating them.
That's why we're ending the video.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Voted, nothing else to say. All right.